For 10 months, the world believed it knew what happened to AIR India Flight 171, 260 people dead, one survivor, and a captain who, investigators said, deliberately cut the fuel to both engines 3 seconds after takeoff. The cockpit voice recorder seemed to confirm it. One pilot asked the other, "Why did you cut off?" The other pilot answered, "I did not do so." India's investigators, US aviation officials, and leaked reports all pointed the same direction, toward the man in the left seat, toward Captain Sumit Sabharwal, a 56-year-old pilot with 15,000 flight hours, a man whose 91-year-old father has been fighting in India's Supreme Court to clear his son's name. On April 12th, 8 days ago, a single frame of airport CCTV footage was subjected to forensic photogrammetric analysis. The result may have just collapsed the entire pilot blame narrative. This is what that image shows. This is why it matters. And this is why the final report, due in less than 8 weeks, may be the most consequential document in aviation safety since the Boeing 737 MAX. Act 1. What we thought we knew. June 12, 2025. Ahmedabad, India, 1:38 p.m. local time. Air India Flight 171, a Boeing 7878 Dreamliner, begins its takeoff roll on runway 23. On board, 230 passengers and 12 crew. Destination, London Gatwick. A scheduled 9-hour flight. After a 62-second roll, the aircraft lifts off at 155 knots. 4 seconds after wheels up, it reaches its maximum recorded speed of 180 knots. Then 3 seconds after liftoff, both fuel control switches move from run to cutoff, 1 second apart. Both engines immediately lose thrust. The aircraft, now at roughly 100 feet above the ground, begins to fall. 32 seconds after takeoff, the plane strikes the hostel building of BJ Medical College, 190 meters from the runway perimeter. On board, 241 of 242 people die. On the ground, 19 more are killed. Crash. The one survivor, Vishwash Kumar Ramesh, seated in row 11A near an emergency exit, opened his eyes after the impact and said, "Everything happened in front of my eyes." Now, the fuel control switches on a 787 are not easy to move accidentally. Each one has a metal stop-lock mechanism that must be physically pulled upward before the switch can move. There are metal guards on either side to prevent accidental contact. These switches exist precisely so no pilot can brush against them mid-flight. The preliminary report from India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau confirmed the switches moved. The flight data recorder recorded it. The sequence was unambiguous. Switches moved. Engines stopped. Plane fell. The question that consumed the investigation for 10 months was, who moved them? Act 2. The pilot blame narrative. In late November 2025, the Wall Street Journal reported that American investigators believed the evidence pointed to deliberate pilot action. Captain Sumit Sabharwal was the prime suspect. Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera went further, reporting that investigators had concluded he likely intentionally moved the switches. By January 2026, Bloomberg confirmed the probe was increasingly focused on deliberate pilot action as the probable cause, with mechanical failure said to be ruled out. The probe had shifted. The narrative had hardened. This was being framed as another pilot suicide, the same conclusion reached in Germanwings 9525, where a co-pilot locked the captain out of the cockpit and flew the plane into the French Alps. The suicide narrative spread. India's pilot associations were furious. The Airline Pilots Association of India stated the investigation was being driven toward a predetermined conclusion. Their president said, "In the Boeing MAX crashes, the first readout said pilot error. They were trying to put it on the pilot. Then the truth came out." The furious response echoed worldwide. The captain's own family launched a legal battle. His 91-year-old father filed a petition before India's Supreme Court demanding a separate judicial inquiry. The Supreme Court acknowledged, in its own words, that there was considerable anxiety among pilots, the bereaved families, and the general public. But there was one detail the pilot blame narrative never adequately resolved. The cockpit voice recorder captured one pilot asking the other why the fuel was cut. and the other pilot answered, "I did not do so." If the captain deliberately crashed the plane, why is he asking his co-pilot why the fuel was cut? Either someone is lying in their final seconds of life, or neither pilot moved those switches at all. Act 3. The image that changes everything. On April the 12th, 2026, the Safety Matters Foundation of India published the results of a photogrammetric analysis, the science of extracting precise measurements from photographs, the same technique used to reconstruct crime scenes and present evidence in court. Their analysis focused on a single frame of airport CCTV footage, time-stamped at exactly 080841 UTC, the moment the aircraft was just airborne over the Ahmedabad runway. In that frame, the Ram air turbine, the RAT, is already deployed, already spinning. The Ram air turbine is a small wind-driven emergency generator that folds out from the belly of a 787. It is the aircraft's last resort for electrical power, and critically, the RAT does not deploy when engines shut down. The RAT deploys when the aircraft has already lost electrical power from its engine-driven generators. In plain terms, the RAT comes out only when the plane is already in electrical failure. According to the flight data recorder, the first fuel control switch moved to cutoff at 080842 UTC, 1 second after the CCTV shows the RAT already deployed and spinning. The Safety Matters Foundation's conclusion was precise. The cause cannot come after the effect. The RAT was out before the switches moved. The aircraft had already suffered a major electrical failure before any fuel was cut, which means the fuel switches may not have been moved by human hands at all. Act 4. What may actually have happened. The Boeing 787 contains a component called the battery diode module. It is the only device protecting the aircraft's main lithium-ion battery from voltage overload. There is no redundancy built in. It is, in engineering terms, a single point of failure. If the battery diode module fails in a short circuit, it exposes the main battery to dangerous voltage and current, which can trigger thermal runaway, a battery fire. When that happens, the hot battery bus, the electrical backbone of the aircraft, can collapse entirely. On the 787, the fuel spar valves are fail-safe closed. They require electrical power to stay open. If that power disappears suddenly, the valves shut. The engines stop, not because a pilot touched anything, because the plane's own electrical system failed. The sole survivor of Flight 171 described what he felt in the seconds after takeoff. Vishwas Kumar Ramesh told reporters the cabin lights began flickering green and white almost immediately after the aircraft became airborne. Flickering cabin lights are not a symptom of a fuel switch event. They are a symptom of electrical instability. Now here is where Boeing's own history makes this impossible to ignore. In 2013, the entire global 787 Dreamliner fleet was grounded after lithium battery fires broke out on 2 separate aircraft. Boeing and the FAA spent months redesigning the battery containment system before the fleet was cleared to fly again. In December 2018, 7 years before Flight 171 crashed, the FAA issued a special airworthiness information bulletin warning that fuel cutoff switches on certain 787-8 aircraft could move from their locked position. That bulletin identified the exact part number fitted to the aircraft that became Flight 171. The inspection it recommended was advisory, not mandatory. Air India never conducted those inspections. Then, in February 2026, 8 months after 260 people died, an Air India Boeing 787-8 on the ground at London Heathrow had its left engine fuel switch move from run to cutoff on its own, twice, during engine start. A crew member touched it gently and it slipped. Air India grounded that aircraft immediately. The same aircraft family, the same switch design, the same failure mode, 8 months later, on a different plane. Act 5. What happens next? The final report on Air India Flight 171 is due by June 12, 2026, the 1-year anniversary of the crash. 53 days from today, India's Supreme Court has ordered the AAIB to submit its findings. Victim families have written to Prime Minister Modi demanding the black box data be made public. And the photogrammetric analysis published April 12th has placed the RAT timing directly in front of the investigators who must now write that report. There are 3 conclusions they can reach. The first, Captain Subharwal deliberately moved those switches, as US and Italian investigators have suggested. This requires a credible explanation for why the RAT deployed before the switches moved, why the cabin lights flickered immediately after takeoff, and why a pilot with 15,000 hours asked his co-pilot why the fuel was cut in the final seconds of the flight. The second, the first officer moved the switches during an emergency response, not deliberately, but as part of a trained procedure. The dual-engine failure checklist on the Boeing 787 actually instructs pilots to move the fuel switches to cut-off, then back to run, as part of the engine restart sequence. If an electrical failure struck first, and the first officer began executing that emergency checklist, the switch movement would appear in the flight data as intentional, even if it was a response to a crisis already underway. The third, the switches moved on their own, not because of any pilot input, because of the same failure mode that moved a switch at London Heathrow 8 months later. A mechanical defect Boeing was warned about in 2018. A bulletin that was advisory, not mandatory. Inspections that were never done. Every element of this scenario sits in official records, preliminary investigation reports, and verified forensic analysis. None of it is speculation. The families of 260 people are waiting for a report that must now account for a CCTV frame that appears to show the aircraft was already failing before the switches ever moved. Vishwas Kumar Ramesh opened his eyes after the impact to find everyone around him had died. He said, from his hospital bed, "I lost everything that day." The final report will either vindicate a dead pilot's name, expose a systemic Boeing failure, or tell the families of 260 people that the answer is still not fully known. Whatever it concludes, the evidence published 8 days ago means the story that dominated this investigation for 10 months is not the whole story. The final report drops in 53 days. This channel will have the full breakdown the same day it publishes. If this investigation matters to you, subscribe now so you don't miss the final report breakdown. Drop your read on this in the comments. Were the pilots cleared by this new evidence, or is there still something unexplained?